What happens next will astound you. But before we begin the narrative, tell us, what happens when a millionaire is ejected off a plane by an unidentified flight attendant? It sounds like the conclusion of the story, right? However, in only 20 minutes, he controls the whole airline. How did this happen? We appreciate your support and feedback from all over the world. If you found this story interesting, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any more incredible stories like this one. On a typical afternoon at JFK Airport in New York, a rich businessman in an immaculate suit arrived at Gate 23, for on his way to London, he didn't exactly exude confidence. No ostentatious jewelry, no brash behavior. In fact, he was almost too ordinary for someone with $1 billion fortune. He gave off the impression of someone who was used to traveling in elegance, but didn't feel the need to show it off. No one in the packed terminal would have guessed that Charles Blackwood, a reclusive billionaire who built his fortune through investments in tech companies, a series of high-profile acquisitions, and a phone call, could alter the trajectory of an entire airline with a single communication as passengers boarded the plane. As usual, Charles was among the first to take his place in business class. The flight went off without a hitch. But that all changed when he encountered Jenna, a flight attendant who had been with the company for more than 5 years. Despite her hardship, Jenna was charismatic, young, and enthusiastic about her job. Meticulously, but by the time she reached Charles's row, her patience had run out due to the day's constant complaints and delays. She paused and made a seemingly mundane request. "Sir, you'll need to turn off your phone and put it in airplane mode." Jenna's tone was more authoritative than polite, but it wasn't. Whenever ERS boarded a plane, they were always reminded of the same thing. But Charles, who seemed engrossed in a document on his tablet, failed to notice the announcement. Instead, he looked up at her and nodded, as most passengers would, ready to follow his instructions. But then something went wrong. Jenna, who had been under a lot of strain all day, saw Charles's delayed reaction as a sign of defiance. She reacted with even more force as she demanded that he turn off his gadget and obey the rules. Charles, who seemed calm and even amused, glanced at Jenna and remained silent for a while. While considering his options, he tried to explain that he didn't want to cause a fuss, particularly when he was on the road, but Jenna wasn't having any of it. So he turned it off. "I'm sorry," he said, but he hadn't realized it was a problem. Charles stared at her for a moment, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had traveled across the globe for what felt like an eternity, but she was determined not to back down. She spoke with an even more stern voice than before, saying, "You're not taking this seriously, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." Business, and no one had ever spoken to him in such a way. However, he was not the type to cause a scene, so he quietly stood up, collected his belongings, and exited the plane. The other passengers stared in shock, confused, but they said nothing until he reached the terminal. Bewildered by the gravity of the situation, Charles refused to let Jenna off the hook. He was determined to ensure that this incident did not go unrecognized, and the consequences of his actions would reverberate throughout the aviation industry. Charles was standing in the airport when his phone called. The caller's voice was calm and straightforward, with a cutting edge that no one, not even the airline's senior executives, could have foreseen. It was his lawyer, Gregory, who had been handling most of his business affairs for years, and who he knew Charles didn't want to become involved, who asked if he wanted him to handle the situation instead of his growing aggravation. Charles hesitated to respond, as he was still reeling from the events of his life. A flight attendant had publicly and tactfully insulted him in the most obvious way imaginable. While most people would have shrugged it off or ignored it, Charles was different. His entire life had been marked by a string of strategizing, and every obstacle, no matter how minor, had always presented an opportunity. But this time, it wasn't about bargaining or profit. It was about power about making an unavoidable statement. "I'm not looking for an explanation or a return," for Charles said in a measured but resolute tone, "I want control. I want to own the airline. Make it happen." Gregory seemed to stop for a while, as if he were attempting to determine the seriousness of Charles's statement. "I want to own it." The Charles quietly laughed, telling Gregory, "Greg, I'm done being underestimated." Gregory had seen Charles's previous bold actions, but this one was different. It was personal. However, Gregory understood that if anybody could carry this off, it would be Charles. It was Charles who wasted no time getting in touch with influential business people and initiating the necessary steps. The legal teams were assembled, and a strategy was being put into action in a matter of minutes. As Charles remained standing there, his initial frustration started to dissipate, replaced by a cold, calculated sense of Charles had a plan. He wasn't going to let this incident go. Instead, he was going to use it as a springboard to shake up the airline industry. He anticipated challenges, such as pushback from executives and legal battles, but he was determined to see it through. Less than an hour after leaving the humiliating airline in his hands, Charles returned to his private office in Manhattan, where he sat in front of a stack of documents. His wealth had always been a shield, but now it was going to be his weapon. Formalities that no longer had any significance for him. He had been involved in many mergers and acquisitions in his career, but nothing compared to this. This wasn't about making a profit. Rather, it was about establishing dominance in a manner that would be remembered for generations. Gregory was on the phone again, this time to update Charles on the situation. "I've prepared offers for you, and he mentioned that we are currently purchasing airline shares. We have the necessary financial backing, and we can move quickly to finalize this deal. However, we will need to move quickly once word gets out in the media." Charles nodded, but Gregory couldn't see him. "It doesn't matter to me how complicated it gets. What matters is that the offer is firm and no reversal occurs," he said, leaning back in his chair and staring out the window. Gazing out the window at the expansive city below, a chilling resolve took hold. It wasn't just about controlling the airline, it was about sending a message to everyone who dared to consider him as an outsider, as if he might be disregarded or disregarded altogether. As the legal team spent the night pouring into the airline's stock options market shares and corporate structure, Jenna, the attendant, had no clue what she had begun. Charles's attorneys called major investors, putting pressure on them to sell their stakes. Gregory's team was planning the last phase, a huge stock buyout that would give Charles the authority to launch a hostile takeover. Time was of the essence, but Charles was certain it would succeed, since he had built his empire on swift, decisive actions. By dawn, the transaction was almost done. Gregory phoned again, his voice nervous but confident. The airline board of directors was on high alert. We had made the last offer. They had only hours to answer. Now it was only a question of, instead of sitting around and hoping they would give in or fight, Charles got to work planning his next move. This was only the start, however. Even if they did fight back, he would have too much power and control over the shares and the law on his side, and a plan to compel them to capitulate. But something else remained in his thoughts. Flight attendant Jenna Charles couldn't help but reflect on how inconsequential she must have felt about him when she expelled him from the plane. She had no clue about his true identity, and she would soon get to appreciate how naive she was. Charles went to the window and watched the city awaken below. He felt a surge of fulfillment. This wasn't simply about acquiring an airline. It was about changing the rules and proving to the world that even the slightest slight can lead to a game-changing move, and the airline was just as good as he was. The following hours were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and rapid-fire emails. Charles hardly slept because he was so focused on owning the airline. He knew it wouldn't be an easy victory for the airline, By mid-morning, the first news stories hit the headlines. Mysterious billionaire makes bid for major airline following public incident. The account about his exploits revealed that the executives were not going to give up lightly, but he had the resources and, most importantly, the determination to outlast them. What began as an innocent occurrence on a flight had quickly escalated into a national scandal. But Charles was unconcerned with the attention it was receiving and was already planning to move on. His attorneys were contacting the airline's board members to convey his offer, and the flight attendant's reaction had been predictable, was set in stone, and the sum he offered for their shares was substantial enough to corner them. The airline's top executives, headed by CEO David Clarkson, were caught off guard. They hadn't anticipated this turn of events. The man they had treated like any other passenger on a commercial flight, as Clarkson, the airline's seasoned CEO who had guided the company through its ups and downs for more than a decade, was taken aback by the arrival of an unexpected and powerful figure. He muttered to himself as he began to unravel the unfolding chaos inside the corporate offices. He had his colleagues glued to the screen, watching the unexpected spike in stock purchases. How had he obtained such rapid control? The executives were in a discussion, attempting to come up with a plan to halt the acquisition. Some had even started to summon their own legal teams to investigate. As they delved further into the matter, it became apparent that Charles had meticulously plotted every move. The shares he had purchased were legally bound, and the conditions of the takeover were impenetrable, and there seemed to be no way out. Meanwhile, Charles reclined in his office, observing the storm from the safety of his glass. From his panelled desk, Charles could see that the airline board would eventually cave in to the offer. The legal fights and opposition were merely pawns in the game, but Charles wasn't in it for the short haul. He had grander ambitions. Point. It wasn't merely about acquiring an airline. It was about making a statement that could not be ignored. He wanted everyone to know that he should not be underestimated. As he observed the negotiations unfold on his computer, he wished flight attendant Jenna knew the domino effect her actions had set in motion. The world would soon learn that the previously strong executives of the airline were coerced into sitting across from Charles at a table giving him ownership of their company. And Charles grinned to himself because this wasn't just a commercial transaction, it was personal, firm. However, there was still one missing piece of the jigsaw. Charles was determined to make a bold statement to everyone who had ever questioned him, so he wouldn't quietly assume control once the purchase was completed. Had everything figured out by the time the clock struck noon, Charles finally got the call he'd been anticipating. It was Gregory, speaking in a calm but urgent tone. The board had approved the deal, and they'd signed off on the acquisition. Charles leaned back in his chair, relieved. Sitting in his chair, a sense of contentment washes over him. He had anticipated it, but hearing the words proved it. The airline that had embarrassed him on that aircraft is now his. The sale went through without a hitch. All the stress, anxiety, and late nights had paid off. He had won. As he began to feel the full impact of his success, a part of him knew that this was only the start. With a composed voice, Charles commanded the media to receive the press release. He wanted the world to know who owned the airline. Now was the time for them to discover the truth. There was a long moment of silence before Gregory spoke up. "Are you sure you want to make a public statement about this? The press is already covering the plane crash. And now this is going to cause a major stir." Charles grinned, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a calculated one. "Exact. Let them speculate and talk all they want. But this isn't about the airline. It's about me, and I want to send a message to anyone who thinks they can bring me down. They need to know that no one respects me, at least not in my world." As the call came to a close, Charles felt a peculiar blend of contentment and expectation. He had accomplished what seemed impossible. something that would be spoken about for years to come. However, there was still one more step. He would not passively let the media to magnify this and go without a trace. Billionaire Charles Blackwood bought the name of an airline during a public auction, and the news spread like wildfire within hours. He intended to ensure that his name would always be associated with the company. Major news outlets worldwide covered the takeover story, which screamed confrontation on flight. Some portrayed it as an act of revenge, while others saw it as a brilliant business move. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Television stations began showing footage of the incident on the plane, and then they cut to Charles, standing proudly outside the headquarters of the airline, addressing the press. He was more than just the man who had acquired an airline. He had also taken a personal insult and turned it into a billion-dollar acquisition. However, the shocker came when in the evening Charles arrived to the corporate headquarters with one more move to make. He wanted to ensure that everyone in the building knew who was in command, so he entered the boardroom where the remaining A group of executives, including CEO David Clarkson, had convened for an urgent meeting. They had anticipated discussing strategies for dealing with the takeover, but they were taken aback when Charles, in his signature crisp suit, strode to the front of the room. "I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm the new owner of Airline Name. I've come to make a formal introduction." His voice pierced through the air as he entered the room with a calm and casual approach. Few adjustments, the executives looked uneasy as they exchanged uneasy looks. Clarkson stood up to shake Charles's hand. Mr. Blackwood spoke in a tense voice, saying, "We didn't anticipate this, but we will do everything in our power to make sure the transition is smooth." Charles did not reply with the expecting cordial conversation, but instead he locked eyes with Clarkson, his gaze steadfast and steely. "I don't need smooth," Charles said plainly. "I need control. I didn't purchase this airline to laze about. I purchased it in response to disrespect. And now it's—" The room fell quiet as everyone realized who had the upper hand. Clarkson, who was clearly anxious, nodded in agreement, but Charles could sense that he wasn't quite understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a simple business meeting, it was personal. Charles turned to leave the room, but not before making one more unsettling comment. "I trust that you'll all do your jobs until the end of the week after that, after which we'll be discussing new leadership." It was clear that no one could stop him now. Once he left the room, everyone remained silent in shock. Outside, the media was waiting for him, and reporters shouted questions. Charles, with a composed face, made his way through the crowd. He had had enough of small talk. He had bigger plans ahead. This was only the beginning of his journey. As he sped away from the building, a smile spread across his face. The flight attendant who had expelled him from the plane would never forget that day, and neither would anyone else. The following days were full of excitement for Charles, as news outlets were abuzz with stories about his surprising acquisition of Charles looked unfazed by the constant stream of media attention. In fact, he flourished in the mayhem. For him, it was no longer about the takeover, rather, it was about the power he had achieved. Executives at the airline's headquarters were frantically trying to recover from the unexpected turn of events, as CEO David Clarkson and the board members, caught off guard by Charles's forceful takeover, were putting in extra hours to adapt to the new reality check. Charles wasn't buying their excuses or assurances. He had previously made it plain that he wasn't in the acquisition to play nice. On the third day, Charles convened a meeting with his new management team. The room was jam-packed with senior executives from the airline, with the majority of them sitting at the head of the table with a self-assured grin on his face. Charles appeared entirely at ease despite the abrupt change in leadership. Looking around at the worried faces in front of him, he asked, "I'm sure some of you have questions," before speaking in a steady, authoritative voice. This airline is going to be distinct, efficient, successful, and most importantly, respectful of people from the ground staff to the customers. Before we get into all that, let me make one thing clear. I'm not here to operate a business the way it has been done for years. Everyone in the room remained still as Charles proceeded, clearly nervous about what he was going to say. "I've heard a lot of complaints about this company's culture," he said, leaning forward ever so slightly. "I've heard that employees are overworked and distracted," he murmured. Someone who has heard that customers are treated like nothing more than a number is correct. However, that is about to change. Our goal is to become the airline that people love to fly with, not the one they hate to fly with. Instead, we want to be the airline that people choose because they know we care about their experience. Is that too much to ask? Charles could feel the executives' anxiety in their eyes as they exchanged awkward looks. But he didn't care. It was his show now, and he needed to set the tone. The executives weren't impressed. Uninterested in engaging in the insidious political maneuvering that had dogged the airline for years, he arrived to implement swift and far-reaching reforms. As the meeting progressed, Charles detailed a laundry list of ideas, including but not limited to improving customer service, streamlining operations, and reducing wasteful spending. However, the most important significant change he announced was a reorganization of the management team. He was not hesitant to make enemies, as he was determined to remove the complacent individuals who had allowed the airline to stagnate for too long. As the meeting came to a close, Charles stood up to signal the end of the session. The executives departed. As they exited the room, many walked with their heads bowed, visibly disturbed by the sudden upheaval Charles had wrought. However, Charles cared little for their unease. He had proved his point. No one would dare challenge him, and he would be treated like a nobody. However, the issue of Jenna and the flight remained unresolved. Charles couldn't help but think about the attendant who had set off this whole chain of events ever since the incident. At first, it had been a passing thought, something he could easily dismiss. But now, after everything he had done, he realized she was more than just an annoyance. She was a symbol of how others failed to recognize his true nature. She was completely unaware of her dealings with him, and Charles was not the type to overlook such indiscretion. He had not yet decided how to handle Jenna, but he was certain that she would not be given a free pass. This was not an issue of vengeance, but of, as the day progressed, Charles remained in his office, meticulously reviewing the final details of the airline's new policy. He wanted to make a message about how, in his world, disrespecting him would result in repercussions. Was already planning ahead, strategizing his next move as the media attention surrounding the takeover began to wane. However, Charles was resolute in his mission to maintain the momentum, assuring everyone that this was not a one-off deal, but rather the start of something significantly larger. He had his sights set on even more. With his recent acquisitions, he now had greater power and influence, and nobody could stand in his way. However, while Charles focused on the future of the airline, the memory of Jenna, the lady who had kicked him, remained in the background. Charles would make sure she remembered her decision to get off the plane, which changed the course of her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. As time went on, his hold on the airline tightened, and the effects of the massive changes he had instituted became apparent. The corporate climate changed from complacency to high-stakes efficiency. The new leadership brought mixed feelings among the employees. Some were skeptical, not sure how it would impact their daily work, but many others were happy about the change. They noticed things were moving faster, decisions were being made with authority, and there was a clear feeling that the company's trajectory steadied as a result of Charles's dogged determination to transform the airline's culture. At weekly meetings with department heads, he demanded progress reports and showed little patience for delays. If an employee wasn't putting in their effort, they were promptly fired. Things started to look up almost immediately. Stock prices rose, customer satisfaction increased, and even the terminal staff appeared more enthusiastic. However, despite all this, he couldn't help but think about Jenna while he concentrated on the day-to-day operations of his new firm. It was evident now that this whole saga had its origins with the flight attendant who had begun it all. Charles still hadn't forgiven her and couldn't stop thinking about how she had treated him that fateful day on the plane. To her, he was merely another passenger, but to him, it had been an insult. The young flight attendant Jenna had planned to embarrass Charles, but now that he owned the airline and was controlling her airline, business, and position, Charles didn't need to behave impulsively. This was all about making a point. Time was his most potent ally, and Charles, who was renowned for his patience, knew that the appropriate moment would soon arrive. He had been given a platform to transform everything, and he planned to use it. Use it to ensure that all employees comprehend the repercussions of underestimating him. Nonetheless, Charles was not going to oppose Jenna without first ensuring that her lesson would be memorable for both her and everyone else who observed. He began to. His staff wasted no time gathering the information he needed on Jenna, who had risen through the ranks of a tiny regional airline to a position at this huge corporation, all the while harboring ambitions of expanding her career. Developing her career, she wasn't exactly a shining star, not yet anyway. What piqued Charles's interest, though, was her inflated feeling of self-importance and her conviction that she could make decisions without taking the broader perspective into account. He found out that she had only been an employee at the airline for a couple of years, but in that brief period, she had came to a point where she felt confident enough to take on a billionaire. This was not behavior that Charles would abide. After all, no one had the authority to depose him, particularly an up-and-coming star with such little experience in the field. Charles came up with a scheme. Instead of immediately terminating her employment or turning her into a public spectacle, he chose to place her in a position where she would be forced to recognize the authority he now possessed. He would ensure that she understood clearly that her actions had consequences, but this would not be an easy task. A brief summary. Charles had larger fish to fry than petty revenge. He secretly ordered his HR staff to compile all the data they could find on Jenna's work history at the firm, including her performance assessments, disciplinary records, and any other relevant documents. The most important aspect of Charles's strategy was his approach to Jenna when he decided to take action, but he would also reveal any complaints against her and her relationships with other staff members if he believed it cast doubt on her competence or ability to perform her job. Was going to be in front of her co-workers and classmates where she would feel the full force of the situation. Charles Blackwood wasn't interested in scolding her, but in making sure Jenna knew who the airline boss was. He would now ensure that her career at the airline would never be the same, just as she had humiliated him by kicking him off that plane. However, he would remove her from the company with such precision that it would be obvious to everyone there that he was his boss. Always one step ahead, Charles left no one, including Jenna, in question of his authority. Little time passed before Charles's plot began to take shape. With his crew collecting all the necessary details about Jenna, her evaluations, and her tenure with the airline. Despite passengers' many gripes about her demeanor, flight attendant Jenna had concealed some of her flaws beneath her icy, no-nonsense exterior. However, Charles could see through her facade, and she appeared to be a person who believed her position granted her it was acceptable to make decisions without fully comprehending their implications. But Charles was in no hurry to act. He preferred to let things simmer until the perfect moment came, when his move would have the greatest impact. He didn't want anyone to assume that his decision was hasty or driven by emotions. This was all about strategy, and Charles, ever the patient, was prepared to wait for the right moment. As the days passed into a week, he continued to oversee the corporate restructuring and shifted his focus to general movements. He meticulously monitored the in-flight schedules, keeping tabs on her shifts and assignments. Wanted to keep it subtle so she wouldn't feel watched, but he needed to make sure she couldn't get out of it when he acted. The day finally arrived, and Charles had just gotten back to the office from a brief meeting with one of his financial partners when he heard that it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance for Charles, who had been waiting for this moment to work a high-profile flight, the sort that garnered attention from journalists and industry insiders. If he could make the most of it, the trip would be a public spectacle and a turning point in his career. The press had been closely following the story of the airline's takeover and its rapid transformation under Charles's leadership. He knew that if he made a move now, they would be there to amplify every moment, and everyone in the airline would understand the consequences of defying him. Charles wasted no time getting the word out. He contacted his director of operations and directed him to have a team of public relations people on board the aircraft in case something unexpected got public. Additionally, he instructed his security team to quietly watch the situation. Charles arrived at the airline terminal that evening, his presence commanding notice even amid the airport's busy bustle. He didn't need to be flamboyant or show off his authority. What mattered was that everything went according to plan. Jenna wouldn't know what hit her, knew exactly what to do with Jenna's frustration, that she was in the midst of an argument with another crew member over some last-minute changes to the flight schedule, because he didn't need any additional display to show that she was there. As Charles collectedly made his way through the terminal, his gaze darted from one person to another. Eventually, it settled on Jenna, who had been chatting with a couple of other crew members when she noticed Charles. She had been so eager to put him down only days before. As soon as she saw him, she froze, a look of terror crossing her face. However, she soon recovered, stood up straight, and offered Mr. Blackwood a kind, if forced, smile. Her voice sounded professional, but the tension was palpable. "Could you please tell me what I can do for you?" Charles, who didn't feel the need to return her greeting with the typical pleasantries, instead locked eyes with her and spoke in a controlled, calm voice that was more intimidating than any shout could have been. I have seen your actions during our last encounter, and I want you to understand that I will not stand for disrespect from those who believe they can get away with it." Jenna's face became somewhat pale as he spoke slowly and deliberately. However, she remained composed and attempted to mask her discomfort with an artificial grin. Charles, however, detected the strain in her body language and abruptly ended her statement by raising an index finger as if to tell her, "You made a choice." Jenna was stuck in the middle of a situation where she felt disrespected by a choice that was disrespectful to both her and the entire company. He paused to let the words sink in, and the room fell silent. The crew members around her had backed away slightly, as if sensing something important was about to happen. She was already aware that she was in the limelight, and I've already talked with HR Charles about it. Starting immediately, you will no longer be responsible for representing Airline name. The business cannot afford to have someone with your demeanor represent it. He hesitated to add that your departure will be Jenna's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and fury, but she refrained from responding because she knew what to say. I want you to realize that the way you treated me was more than a small incident. It was a statement. Now I'm making mine. Charles turned to leave, but not before casting her a last look and saying, I hope you understand that this wasn't just a firing, it was a calculated public humiliation. Her pride prevented her from showing weakness, but she could feel the floor crumble under her. Charles strode out of the airport, leaving behind a surprised and embarrassed Jenna who remained frozen in place, saying coldly, "Learn something from this. It's not just about what you do, it's about who you do it to." He felt he had made his point to her and everyone else watching as the door shut behind him. In the days to come, headlines would fill the media about the inexplicable fall of one of the top workers of Swift. But the greater story was a frenzy of media interest swept over the tale of Jenna's unexpected and very public termination in the following days, as Charles Blackwood's reputation as a formidable opponent continued to emerge. Quickly, word got out via news sources, social media, and even airplane passengers about what had transpired. Some called it vicious, while others thought it was justified. Either way, Charles Blackwood had made his point, and the lesson was clear. Never underestimate him. Even as the media focused on Jenna's demise, Charles remained focused on setting a precedent, that his word was final and no one would dare treat him like an ordinary man again, and making sure everyone in the company and the industry understood this. Board members and executives who had been apprehensive about the changes were beginning to appreciate Charles's leadership as he solidified his power and ensured that the airline's new direction was firmly established behind closed doors. Under his guidance, the stock of the airline was growing at a faster rate than anybody had anticipated, and its operational efficiency was enhancing as a result. Charles didn't squander any time reveling in his triumph, even though he knew that the world wouldn't be content with a single, daring move. The public's focus had shifted away from Jenna and her story, and they were beginning to forget about her. However, Charles was determined to maintain their interest in something that would establish his authority, so he called a company-wide meeting that would serve as a strategic meeting as a public demonstration of his authority, and to provide an update to the entire management team and key staff members, including those brought in by the previous leadership. Charles, who had always believed in being straightforward, intended to demonstrate his seriousness on the day of the meeting. Everyone was nervously taking their seats, anticipating the unexpected. They knew the company had changed under Charles's leadership, but no one could guess what he would do next. The room was filled with executives, staff, and key figures from all departments. No dramatic entrance or showmanship was required as Charles strided confidently to the front of the room, greeted the assembled guests with a soothing voice, and changed the tone of the room. His very presence was enough to have everyone sit up straight. He began by pausing to let the word hang in the air before continuing, "When I bought this airline, it wasn't just for the money." He went on to say, "I don't need to tell you all how far this company has come in the last week. You've seen the results. We're moving in the right direction." However, he changed the subject from numbers to standards. "I didn't invest in this firm for the stock or the fancy jets. I invested in it because I saw unrealized potential. However, potential is meaningless if we fail to achieve the criteria I'm establishing." A murmur went throughout the room, with some people nodding in agreement and others seeming nervous. Charles could tell that there were mixed feelings about the new direction, as some people were on board with it and others were hesitant. Charles said, "We won't get there if we continue to allow people to cut corners. This company is going to be a force in the airline industry. In spite of our uncertainties, he was assembling a team of individuals who would either rise to the challenge or fall by the wayside. No one in this room could ever question his dedication to the cause because he looked directly at every executive as he spoke. Whether they were ground crew members or flight attendants, everyone here needed to know that excellence was not something they could afford to slack off on." With his words finally sinking in, the audience became silent. "We've made and will continue to make a lot of changes. I've started reviewing the leadership team, and some of you will be moving into new positions. Others," he hesitated, his eyes narrowing, "will be departing." Nobody dared to speak, since Charles had already made it apparent that there would be no place for if anybody wanted to remain after having their turn. If that doesn't work, I'm sure you'll find other possibilities elsewhere. To top it all off, Charles added, his voice becoming even more grave, I don't want to, as he demanded that everyone who didn't share his vision either step up or go. This included many who had been content to coast along in their previous positions without significant challenge. I refused to listen to any more accounts of workers being disrespected or mistreated. This is a business that prioritizes its people above its bottom line. Everyone in the room nodded in agreement. There was no space for discussion. As the conference came to a close and attendees started to leave, Charles could feel the nerves building up. He had made his intentions plain, and everyone in the room knew they had to get in line. Now that he had revolutionized the airline and the whole business culture, no one could contest his authority. Those who had doubted him or felt they could avoid up to the task would start to crumble in the weeks ahead. The flight attendant who had kicked Charles off the plane would soon be forgotten as a tale of power, determination, and brutal success took center stage, as Charles was determined to transform the airline into his own image. As time passed, Charles Blackwood solidified his grip on the airline, making his vision a reality. The changes he had promised began to permeate the company, and his legacy would live on as the man who took control of his own destiny, as well as an airline. As he basked in the triumph of his aggressive reorganization, one problem remained. Employees who had previously coasted through their work were now working at maximum capacity, driven by the fear of losing their jobs if they failed to meet the new, higher standards. The company's long-stricken culture of mediocrity was being gradually dismantled. He couldn't shake the image of Jenna's face, which had been nagging at him ever since she left. Her defiance and inability to accept him as he really was had prompted him to make a statement, proving to her and everyone else that crossing Charles Blackwood had, while the immediate aftermath of her dismissal was satisfying, Charles soon realized that it fell short of providing the closure he had sought and the inspiration he needed to complete the project he had begun with Jenna. He had already taken over the airline, and now he wanted to make sure she and everyone else knew how powerful he was. It wasn't about getting even anymore. Now it was about changing the story and establishing his legacy as more than simply the owner of an airline. But as a man with the power to change destiny, Charles was determined not to let Jenna's departure blend into the company's fast transition. Instead, he wanted her name entwined with his in a manner that would haunt her for the rest of her life, reminding her of the mistake she had made. He intended to use his power to alter the future of whomever he wanted. After Jenna was fired, his public relations team investigated her life extensively and discovered, unsurprisingly, that she was having trouble finding a new job. Charles Blackwood wanted more than just a setback for her career. He wanted to ensure that she would never work in the industry she had loved so much again. Word got around about the flight attendant who had crossed him, and her reputation took a hit. "I want you to make sure that Jenna can never work as a flight attendant again," Charles Blackwood instructed his legal team, in an effort to ensure that the stigma of disrespecting him would follow her wherever she went. "We're going to get ahead of the story and make sure it's known why she was let go. Let's create the case using her own acts." The legal team got to work. They discreetly contacted people in the industry, important decision-makers at other airlines, and anybody who might be able to hire her. They meticulously crafted a story that put all the responsibility on Jenna's shoulders. She had disobeyed company policy, behaved in an unprofessional manner, and, in the end, failed to understand the seriousness of her actions. They also made sure to bring up her disciplinary history, making her seem like a liability to any potential employer. Charles was playing a long game. Didn't have to move quickly. What was important was that the story stick, so that Jenna was forever associated with being an unruly and unprofessional employee. If this happened, no one would hire her because her reputation would be so ruined. Meanwhile, Charles made sure to emphasize his position by his command of the media, and ability to maintain the focus on himself allowed him to exert public dominance. He spoke at industry conferences and gave interviews to the press, outlining his vision for the future of the airline. Time and again, he took daring, decisive actions that made his rivals run for cover. While Jenner was trying to gather momentum, TR's legal staff was busy behind the scenes issuing letters to other airlines, using the type of power that only someone in total control could command. No one questioned his judgments. After a few weeks, word quietly spread through the industry that Jenner Richards, a former flight attendant, had been permanently blacklisted from major airlines for her unprofessional behavior while working for airline name. Although the story didn't make it into the mainstream media, those in the know took note. Everything was very clear. Jenner had messed up, and now she would pay the price. Whenever her name was brought up, it would bring up the reason she was no longer flying. In the meanwhile, Charles's airline was doing well thanks to the customer-centric reorganization. As he sat in his office, Charles watched as satisfaction levels rose, staff morale reached new heights for those who remained, and the company's stock reached new heights. From what had started as a negative, a single incident of disrespect, he had created a whole empire based on his vision of brutal greatness. While he was engrossed in reviewing the latest financial reports, a contented grin spread across his face. He had accomplished all that he had set out to do. The airline was under his control, the media was afraid of him, and Jenner was nothing more than a distant memory, a memory that would haunt her forever. It was then that he had a revelation. As Charles continued to navigate the ever-expanding landscape of his airline empire, he became acutely aware of the power he had amassed. This wasn't just about taking control of an airline. It was about sending a message to the world. Not even a flight attendant could challenge him and get away with it. From a financial standpoint, he remained a billionaire mogul who dabbled in acquisitions, but in the eyes of the public, he had transformed into an unstoppable force in the aviation industry, a figure whose decisions, whether concerning the fate of the airline or the treatment of individuals, send shockwaves through the industry. In the weeks after Jenner's death, the airline persisted in thriving, but Charles wasn't content with only ensuring flawless operations. He wanted to expand into the competitive landscape of the airline. He made sure everyone knew it via the media and the market. The industry was very competitive, and although Charles had captured a sizable portion of it, he still faced competition. He had made it plain that he wasn't content to coast. Rather, he aimed to dominate. His next move, as a strategic thinker throughout his career, was to expand his airline. Charles saw an opportunity to show off his dominance by acquiring a smaller competitor, a regional airline that had been causing a stir in the industry. Despite its immense growth potential, the company lacked the resources necessary to break into the larger market. He wanted to take the company beyond its current limits. Another swift and harsh acquisition procedure was initiated by Charles. He wasted no time in offering a bargain that the board members of the smaller airline couldn't reject, and they did not. The sale was finalized within a few weeks. With this acquisition, Charles added another feather to his already impressive cap. It sent a message to everyone who was paying attention, not only the airline industry. Charles Blackwood was a man who got what he wanted quickly. He started making changes right away. Bringing in his trusted team of Charles, didn't care if the executives who had helped him rebuild his airline from the bottom up disagreed with his methods. He and his team began integrating the smaller airline's operations into his. However, as with any acquisition, some employees resisted his methods. While the hiatus, there were internal power battles. arguments about the best way to merge the two enterprises, and increasing pains as the bigger airline devoured the smaller one. However, Charles remained unfazed and successfully navigated the merger. Within a few months, the combined airline was stronger than ever. Its reach was broader, its reputation for efficiency and customer service was cemented, and its stock price soared. Investors saw the clear path to success, and the visionary knew that these were just hurdles to be cleared. The direction Charles was heading took off, and the company reached new heights as a result. However, there was still one unresolved issue, and that was with Jenna, whose actions had set off all this. Charles had used her as an example, but now he understood that for the first time in weeks, Charles started to think about her again, wondering if she had learned her lesson and, more importantly, if there was anything more he could do to salvage her career in the airline. It wasn't just about making her a cautionary tale. It was about ensuring she remained a cautionary tale. Charles sat down at his desk on a wet Thursday afternoon, glass of scotch in hand, considering the business. He somehow felt it was just the beginning of his ability to ensure that her name would be associated with his for years to come. The purchase was a smashing success, and the business was booming. But Charles still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Jenna's name lingered in the back of his mind like an itchy itch. He had triumphed over Jenna's challenge, but she wasn't your average flight attendant. She deliberately chose to ignore him, treating him like any other customer. This decision put in motion a chain reaction of he had to make sure that everyone would remember the lesson he had given Jenna, which would transform the business. So Charles started planning again. His first thought was that if he could permanently bring Jenna's downfall to an end, then no one would dare to cross him again. However, he eventually realized that he couldn't. Charles would make sure that Jenna's name would always be associated with him, regardless of her whereabouts or actions, and this wouldn't end with the airline industry. It would escalate into something much greater. First things first, he made sure her name stayed on the airline industry's blacklist by getting in touch with his legal team and telling them to covertly inform his competitors. He had extensive connections in the aviation industry and used them all to make sure that no airline, no matter how big or small, would ever consider. Because of her ties to Charles's public enemy, no one was willing to hire her for fear of negative publicity. However, Charles wasn't content to stop there. He used his media connections to spread rumors about Jenna's lack of professionalism and the dangers she posed to potential employers. Precedent she had created by challenging a prominent industry leader like Charles. He made sure to highlight how her actions had brought about her career's demise and how she had severed ties with several influential people in the field. As the weeks went by, Jenna was covered extensively in industry journals, news websites, and business publications, serving as a cautionary story not just in the aviation sector but across different media platforms. Her name was often accompanied by the adjectives unprofessional, defiant, and disrespectful. It became evident that Charles had finished her career, or what little it had been, by ensuring that Jenna's name would forever be associated with failure in the airline industry. The media frenzy surrounding her collapse made it impossible to ignore, and he was satisfied with his power, was undeniable, and he had complete control. However, Charles was well aware that he couldn't afford to rest on his laurels. There was always more to conquer. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, planning for what came next. Purchase, the subsequent expansion, the subsequent move. However, he knew in his heart that regardless of his success, it would all circle back to that fateful plane ride, the moment when Jenna had attempted to embarrass him. That was the moment that had ignited everything, and now he had made sure that the world would never again disregard it. The months that followed were a whirlwind of accomplishments, appearances, and acquisitions. Charles's name was already almost a byword for influence in the aviation sector. He had transformed a little slip of the tongue into a Billy doll empire, yet regardless what external achievement, Charles had started to undergo a personal transformation. He had consistently been always focused on the next objective, spurred forward to his current position. But now that he felt a sensation he had never felt before as he gazed out over his quickly expanding empire. Devoid of substance, the triumph over Jenna had been delightful, although it had been transient, had established his supremacy, shown his might and solidified his legacy, yet it still didn't seem sufficient. It wasn't only about getting money or taking advantage of others anymore, Charles had realized. Command. At some point his desire for power got the better of him, and now he stood in the middle of nothing, wondering aloud what on earth the purpose of it all was. Charles started to doubt his decisions as he sat in his office, surrounded by irrelevant documents and reports. Was he acting morally, or had he transformed into the merciless person he once hated? A successful businessman who demolished all obstacles on his way to success poured himself another drink and stared out at the while. He gazed out the window at the cityscape. He wondered whether he had changed for the better. Ideally, he couldn't answer the question that had been nagging at him for some time. Throughout the course of many weeks, Charles struggled with an increasingly profound feeling of dissatisfaction with the contentment he used to have with every new partnership. His empire had grown beyond his wildest dreams, like if struck by lightning. Dreams. But now that he had reached the pinnacle of his career, he had an unexplained emptiness that the rush of excitement that had propelled him through his most difficult fights seemed to elude him, no matter how much money or power he possessed. Whether in the workplace or in one's personal life, grudges started to seem pointless. That the victories weren't satisfying, but rather that they were insufficient when, upon assuming management of the airline, everything seemed to be a game, a challenge to demonstrate his pride in his accomplishments, especially in comparison to those who had doubted him before his victory. Unimaginable, the joy of triumph had faded after he vanquished his enemies. Solidified his position in the corporate realm and established a legacy that would last for generations later, Charles sat at his desk, wondering what would happen next. Sprawled out before him was a mountain of reports and company memoranda, the meticulous detail of which had previously delighted him. Careful analysis of the data in preparation for future strategic moves, but today's statistics seemed immaterial. He began to fantasize about the time before the airline purchase, when his ambition was unbridled and pure. His life was simpler. Not only did he feel the weight of the empire on his shoulders, but he also came to terms with the fact that, although it felt good at the moment, his triumph over Jenna had transformed him into someone he hadn't anticipated. His actions had gone beyond removing her from the profession to guaranteeing her demise, all in the name of proving a point. He had become obsessed with her. Moment to convey his message, but was it worthwhile? Charles pushed set aside the reports, reclined in his chair, gazed out the window at the world was brimming with opportunities and obstacles just waiting to be conquered, and yet he found himself questioning if the pursuit was. The more he pondered it, the clearer something became that he hadn't quite grasped, but it was still worth the reward. In the past, he had grown into a man whose success was measured by his triumphs. Yet those triumphs it would have been meaningless for him to fight if he had no idea why he was fighting. Eventually became a craving for dominance via crushing, but once he accomplished that, he discovered thinking about whether he could keep fighting if he achieved this level of achievement. He needed more than just strength if his only adversary remained to be himself. Had to rediscover his life's mission, one that included more than only showing off his abilities, but also finding contentment with his own success. Maybe he needed to take a step back and reassess his life and objectives, but he didn't know where to start. For the first time in years, Charles chose to ease off the relentless pace he had set for himself. contemplated taking a temporary break from the business world since he has the means to do so indefinitely, money, a legion of advisors, and a company that could function. Without him for a while, he decided to walk away from the boardrooms and brainstorming meetings and consider the world through fresh eyes. The concept relaxing wasn't as simple as it seemed for Charles, who wasn't used to being still. His whole life had been consumed with construction, struggle, and conquest, but now the prospect of taking it easy looked strangely enticing, so he decided to take a little break. A break from the daily grind would provide him time to think, reevaluate, and reflect on his life's mission. He planned a vacation to the Caribbean in the hopes of discovering what was actually lacking in his life. A break from the corporate world where he could focus only on the sky and ocean. Regardless of the doubts that would arise from even his closest associates, he was determined to go forward with this. He found the island to be a serene respite from the hectic city of Manhattan, and the calming sound of the waves lapping on the coast contrasted with the relentless roar of his business empire. And after what seemed like an eternity, Charles finally gave himself permission to unwind. Lounging on the beach, going on long walks, reading literature he'd put off for years, and meeting locals were his daily activities. Unknown to him, he was only a tourist in a paradisiacal place that seemed untouched by the stresses of the outside world. World he had evacuated, yet even in this tranquil environment, thoughts would often resurface about, notwithstanding his success in the corporate world, he couldn't shake the uneasy sensation that something was lacking. The things he had accomplished or the successes he had experienced in the past were what had previously guided him and given him a sense of purpose. When he sat on the throne of wealth, every choice appeared to propel him forward. Balcony, as he watched the sun set one night, a realization dawned on him. Maybe this was the catalyst for his felt so empty that he began playing a new game, instead of just creating for the purpose of building. It cared more about clinging to power for its own purpose than about really creating something new, grown stifled by his own success. Is there any way to begin over in order to overcome it? Fragments of his empire, and build something fresh, unmotivated by self-centeredness or the need to supremacy, but not by force, but by a more profound force. The idea was both freeing and terrible, yet it was Charles came back from his vacation with a fresh perspective after spending a week alone. Still didn't know everything, but something had changed during his absence, and he realized now that the fulfillment he craved couldn't be found by amassing more power or acquisitions, instilling dread in others or coercing them into respect by using his power for when he first considered the individuals he had abandoned, including the workers who had contributed to his ascent to the top, the one on who had toiled away to help him realize his dream. Up until this point, he had only considered them as instruments in his toolbox, but now I'm beginning to question if he was mistaken. What if the real worth of his empire wasn't in its wealth, but in the way he rewarded his employees for their contributions? Charles met with his senior advisors and executives to examine about the airline. He would not leave the firm since he continued to have faith in it. He was confident in its capabilities, but he wanted to transform its operations into something more than a financial entity. He envisioned Powerhouse as a symbol of honesty, reverence, and he established new leadership initiatives for his staff to foster development that did not harm others. He dedicated himself to fostering mentoring and professional growth, while also implementing more environmentally friendly policies in the company's activities, and started advocating for CSR initiatives. At first, his advisors were skeptical, since this Charles wasn't the same one they knew. Vicious businessman who was just concerned with profits. But as time went on, they started to see a change. The shift wasn't limited to Charles's financial goals. He was also eager to have a positive impact in other areas. The company, Charles discovered that he needed to strike a balance in his life, reserving moments to spend with loved ones, renewing relationships with long-lost acquaintances, and though he couldn't change what had already happened, he could make something fresh out of his time spent helping for causes he'd long since disregarded. One whose defining characteristics were not power and conquest, but rather a deeper sense of purpose for progress and, maybe, as a redemptive experience, Charles came to terms with the fact that controlling the airline wasn't his greatest victory. Although there would still be many obstacles to overcome, he had succeeded in reclaiming his humanity by vanquishing his adversaries. After what seemed like an eternity, Charles finally started to put into action the changes he had been seeking. At work, he saw a difference in the level of respect that had previously been established between him and his co-workers. His executives, who had previously been apprehensive of his more brutal approaches, were beginning to feel pressure from a more fundamental source. Were re-establishing their faith in him, not out of fear of his authority, but rather as a result of his efforts to construct something more substantial, a different guy than when he had originally assumed leadership of the Charles, the airline pilot, had discovered that strength came from inside, not from external sources. How he gradually started to nurture his ability to wield his power for the benefit of others. He prioritized the health and happiness of his employees in order to create an environment that encouraged teamwork, advancement, and success. Began programs to contribute to the areas that the airline serves and made it plain that no individual, regardless of throughout Charles's transformation, his viewpoint remained paramount to the fundamental principles of honesty and decency. His desire remained a motivating factor, and he found it hard to change certain old behaviors. Even though he had lost interest in crushing his rivals, he had no intention of halting his efforts to increase the airline's success. Kept expanding, and with each new purchase or collaboration, Charles had the same thrill. This time, however, it wasn't motivated by a thirst for victory, but rather by the task of creating something lasting. As time went on, and Charles's metamorphosis became apparent to the firm, he would leave a legacy that went beyond riches. His new leadership style fostered growth, and he struck a healthy balance between pursuing goals and showing empathy in his interactions with whenever workers' interactions shifted from transactional to real. Folks weren't. He had finally found the solution to the issue that had plagued him. What happens next? As they worked with him, not just for him, subsequent response was uncomplicated expansion, but with a goal in mind. Charles saw that the key to success wasn't overpowering others, but rather laying a self-sustaining foundation. As he gazed at his empire in the aftermath of his death, he no longer experienced. Despite the emptiness he felt, he was certain that the lessons he had learnt, particularly on the journey, would be with him forever. Not seeing the flight attendant as a representation of the person who expelled him months before, but rather as an embodiment of despite his disdain for her, he recognized in her the spark that ignited a personal revolution inside him. The real triumph. I appreciate you tuning in, and if you like the tale, please like, share, and click the like button. Leave a comment with your opinions and subscribe for more content from the channel.